And actually what I wanted to do that's a little bit different, if it's okay. I wanted to start us out, and this is not a copywritten video because it exists on YouTube. I wanted to show this video that comes from Brene Brown, and it's about the difference between sympathy and empathy in like a cartoon version. And it may be silly, but I thought we'd give it a try. So we're going to just start with it, and we'll see if it's helpful and or where it takes us. So let me do this. And it's this one.
With Mail.
And sorry for the ad. Here we are.
So what is empathy, and why is it very different than sympathy? Empathy fuels connection. Sympathy drives disconnection. Empathy, it's very interesting. Teresa Wiseman is a nursing scholar who studied professions, very diverse professions where empathy is relevant, and came up with 4 qualities of empathy. Perspective taking, the ability to take the perspective of another person or recognize their perspective as their truth. Staying out of judgment, not easy when you enjoy it as much as most of us do. Recognizing emotion in other people and then communicating that. Empathy is feeling with people. And to me, I always think of empathy as this kind of sacred space when someone's kind of in a deep hole and they shout out from the bottom and they say, I'm stuck, it's dark, I'm overwhelmed. And then we look and we say, hey, you climb down. I know what it's like down here, and you're not alone. Sympathy is, ooh, it's bad, no, you want a sandwich? Empathy is a choice, and it's a vulnerable choice, because in order to connect with you, I have to connect with something in myself that knows that feeling. Rarely, if ever, does an empathic response begin with at least. Yeah. And we do it all the time. Because you know what? Someone just shared something with us that's incredibly painful, and we're trying to silver lining it. I don't think that's a verb, but I'm using it as one. We're trying to put the silver lining around it. So, I had a miscarriage. Oh, at least you know you can get pregnant. I think my marriage is falling apart. At least you have a marriage. John's getting kicked out of school. At least Sarah is an A student. But one of the things we do sometimes in the face of very difficult conversations is we try to make things better. If I share something with you that's very difficult, I'd rather you say, I don't even know what to say right now, I'm just so glad you told me. Because the truth is, rarely can a response make something better. What makes something better is connection.
Okay, I hope that was a little bit helpful. One of the things that she teases out, one of the things she teases out like over and over again is, again, the difference between sympathy and empathy, and how like we really like conflate that they mean the same thing, and that we often practice sympathy and not empathy, and especially with ourselves. Right. And so, you know, we talked a little bit last week, and a few people shared with me, like independently, like, boy, you know, it's not that empathy is so hard. It's just that it's really tiring because it takes really a lot of time and investment of energy. And one of the things that Brene Brown shares before we go to nonviolent communication is that empathy is unlike commodities. You know, commodities are limited. There's only so much. So when you use them up, they're gone. And empathy, she says from her data, is actually like a muscle. So the more you use it, the more you're able to use it. And that makes it rather different from corn and iridium and things like that. A few people said, well, don't you get empathy fatigue? And to be honest, I do, but I can't always figure out when. Sometimes being empathetic is actually energizing for me. And I can never quite figure out when it's going to go which way. Because as I mentioned, I think empathy doesn't mean I enter into that hole and stay there. It means I enter and then I'm able to leave. And there's times when I can put empathy down. I don't mean when I'm done with it, but when we leave, I can put it down. And then oddly enough, there's times that I just can't seem to put it down. And those are things to be mindful of. Actually, it's like maybe worth keeping like a exhausting empathy journal to see which types bother us the most. And usually there's something going on in us when that's the case. Usually it speaks to like, there's something you're really working to deal with. I mean, I'll just tell you, this is going to sound really strange. Most deaths are not fatiguing for me. Being present with people in grief in general, not fatiguing for me. I know that's really odd. And I don't think it's because I'm cavalier, actually. I don't think so. It's just not something I struggle with. After I'm with people in the funeral home or in the hospital, I'm able to put it down. There's other stuff that just rattles my cage, though. And I don't know if it's because I've done it enough. I mean, the first couple times I was with people who died young, it was tough. And part of this because I was trying to fix things. I was like, well, what can I do for you? Do. Maybe I can cook for you. And they were like, no, sweetie, like we cook ourselves. Like that's, well, yeah, I just didn't know what to do. And they were like, you don't need to do anything. It's okay. Like they were actually taking care of me in my let's fix this business. And I do think that's part of the empathy bit is like, again, figuring out what our triggers are and like what we carry and what's hard for us. And then like being curious about it, because it's not that it's fatiguing just to have empathy. It's not. The question is like, what's that getting at in me? Like, why is that? Why am I having a hard time putting this down when I leave? Kathy?
Well, I just from listening to you and what I have been thinking of, I'm an Enneagram 2, and my sole motivation is helping people. And I really struggle with that because as soon as you tell me about a need or a problem, I want to jump in there and fix it. I want to help you. I mean, that's like my driving motivation. And it's very, very hard for me to step back and just be with someone. And I am trying to work on that. And I'm pretty bad at it, but I'm trying to make a difference. Sometimes people want to vent, sometimes they want to brainstorm, sometimes they just want you to be with them. And I tend to always go into the helper mode.
So for people like us, Kathy, because I like to accomplish things, it's really helpful for me to have a checklist that says, I really want to fix this. And the best way to fix it is to not try to fix it. And then I can check that box. I know that's weird, but I can honor my intention by saying it just like that. Aha, I'm going to be efficacious by not trying to fix. Check. And there's nothing wrong about doing it that way. It honors the intention to fix, and it's just the strategy is different. I don't know. That's helped me sometimes. Where are other folks with this? Julia, please.
Well, sorry. Graciela, do you want to go?
Well, no, you go ahead. You go first and then I'll go.
Okay, I'm probably going to do a bad job because I'm not quite sure what I'm trying to synthesize a lot of things I've been learning about. So I think I said at some point a while back that I'm doing this course with the first year medical students called the Physician Healers Track. And so it's super cool. I feel like I'm taking it myself more than doing anything for them. But we're reading nonviolent communication, or we're going to read nonviolent communication. And this past Tuesday, we meet like once a month and have a discussion. And this past Tuesday was about self-compassion, which was kind of fitting for this week's reading in nonviolent communication. And I listened to, so I don't know if anyone's familiar with Kristen Neff, but she does a lot of work with self-compassion versus this idea of versus empathy. And so in the healthcare industry right now, there's a lot of people are saying compassion fatigue because of, the pandemic and all of that or whatever. But it was interesting to me because I attended this lecture where it talked about how, especially for, I guess it could be for anything, but it was related to healthcare, but how, when we empathize, with pain. You're actually seeing someone else suffering, and that, like, when you see them suffer, that actually activates our mirror neurons and this neural circuitry, and so it can lead to those same feelings within yourself. But that can actually lead to this sort of secondary traumatic stress syndrome. So when people that we love are going through these really, or, you know, if our patients are going through something that's really traumatic, we can take on that trauma because of empathizing with it. And so ultimately what happens is that you then start feeling, you take on all of that, those feelings and emotions that the other person is feeling. Like, they've done these studies where it actually activates these sections in your brain. And so you start taking on all those feelings and emotions, and that can lead to this, you know, secondary traumatic stress. And so talking about the only way that you can really do that is to have compassion, like, versus empathy. Like, you're compassionate with the other person, not necessarily empathetic with them. And that compassion is more of this, it's like a positive feeling versus sort of some of the, this is where I get kind of, it's sort of difficult to tease out, but it's like, it's more of like a positive experience with that other person versus that potential for the, like, taking on all of that, all of those other feelings that the other person feels, if that makes any sense. I don't know. I thought it was kind of an interesting sort of delineation between empathy and compassion. Anyway, I don't know if anyone has any comments about that.
Well, the words are also similar, right? And probably you learned this when you were in the 10th grade, learning SAT words. This was back when they used to have vocabulary in the SAT. I don't think they do anymore. But pathos, right, is different from bathos. And it's about that sort of deep, it's not always suffering, really. It's just sort of that, like, that deep feeling. So empathy is like having pathos with somebody, and sympathy is having pathos like somebody, right? And so, like, of course, you can never feel like somebody else, even if you've had exactly the thing happen to you, because you've got different cognitive maps, right? So sympathy is like projecting your feeling onto them instead of trying to underneath the particulars identify with the pathos that you might have in common. And compassion is an interesting one, right? Because com means with as well, and passion is sort of that Latin word that's similar to pathos, right? I mean, usually we say the passion is like the suffering. It's usually how it gets mapped, although, like, maybe about 10 years ago, people started saying, what are you passionate about? Especially evangelical circles. It kind of made me want to, like, throw up down my shirt after a while, because it's like what we kept saying, like, what's your passion? But I think they really, they're aimed at a similar thing. And what we often don't remember is that, like, when it's somebody's birthday, if you choose to be happy with them, that's empathetic. I don't know, Julia, I mean, it gets to a point about splitting hairs that's really, really difficult. I mean, I have to admit, and I'd be interested if you've got, like, some good hardware on this, compassion and empathy, they're like kissing cousins in my head. And if you asked me to say how they're different, I don't know that I could do it. I'm wondering if you could.
I don't know that I can. Again, I'm trying to, like, synthesize what I learned from this lecture, you know, a couple months ago, but and the notes that I took from it. But basically this idea is, and again, it was self-compassion for healthcare workers. So it was within that context, but I think it could be applied for different things. But it was talking about care for others without losing yourself. And I guess the main thing that I saw that was sort of different is that when you kind of empathize, right, and you're going there and you're experiencing those feelings, and you get to that place where you're, like, it becomes this secondary trauma, then that you ultimately, like, especially like with Brene Brown and the ladder, like if you don't have that ladder to get yourself back up out of it, right? If that makes sense, like, you know, if you don't have those tools to get yourself out of it, that you ultimately take on that suffering and that pain. And so then you like push away the triggers. And so those triggers, so like in healthcare, right? Like physicians are like, the patient becomes the enemy, right? In a way, because you can't deal with their suffering, because it's just exhausting for you to just deal with it all the time. And so the difference, at least in this conversation, that or lecture, was that empathizing leads to the potential for that secondary trauma and that negative experience and that pushing away of the triggers, whereas compassion is more of a positive experience, and it's like rewarding for everyone that's involved. If that makes sense. I don't know if it does. Anyway.
Graciela, please.
Well, you know, I was thinking, and all of my years of teaching and when I was working with kids, I was always working with inner city kids. So there were always dramatic things that would be brought to the classroom. And I couldn't fix their homes, if that makes sense to you.
Right.
So I couldn't go and fix their homes. I couldn't provide the money that they needed or stop the father that was beating up on a child. But I could provide an environment in my classroom, and it was these classrooms were self-contained. So they were in there with me all day long, or I was with them. Both, we were together all day long. And I just tried to provide experiences in the classroom that would be, I guess, empathetic in terms of providing some, and I also gave them the opportunity to share some of the sorrows that they were going through. And I don't know if, but they could empathize with each other, and because they were all kind of many of them were going through the same thing. I remember, I'll just very quickly tell this story. A kid came in one day and I said, "How are you this morning?" And he said, "Well, let's see, my dad slugged me and he had a bruise on his face. And he was angry at me and he hit me." Well, first we had a nurse, so I could get the nurse to put something on his bruise, but it wasn't my place to call the police or to send police to the house. So then all I could do was provide some help for him immediately. And then the rest of the classroom time and whatever was going to happen in the classroom, I paid attention to what he was doing. I talked to him privately, and you can't fix, those are really hard. And I don't know how you separate sympathy from empathy, and in those situations, it was very difficult because it happened regularly. That was part of their environment that they lived in. I remember one time a student said to me, "Ms. Kavula, the thing is that you can get in your car and you drive away from this neighborhood. I don't get in a car and drive away. Yeah. I live here."
Yeah.
And, you stay speechless when a child tells you that, and just provide the best you can. So just depend, the situations are always different. I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely.
In the situation.
Darlene, I saw you ready to go as well.
Yes, for me, it's more, it's not so much defining what's happening inside of me at the time. It's what I do with it afterwards that helps me to compartmentalize their pain from my pain, or which helps me to understand my pain, why it's so extra painful. It's how I define it in my head afterwards. And I like what Graciela said about telling myself, I can't change that. What I can do, I can't change the stimulus of their pain. What I can do is change how I react to it. And what I am doing is all that I can do. So there's that cognitive shift in what is within my power. I also do some behavior things that help me compartmentalize it. I remember when I first started working with people in their pain, and my daughter was maybe 3rd grade, 4th grade, and I would come home from all this empathetic being with people, and I carried their pain home with me, so much so that I was obsessed with it and I couldn't let it down, and I couldn't focus on my daughter. I mean, she was there, she needed me. I was physically there, but I wasn't emotionally there. So I realized this is not going to work. If I keep doing this, I'm not being a good mom. If I keep doing it this way, I'm going to burn out and I'm going to have to quit because it was extremely painful. So I developed some behaviors that helped me compartmentalize it. At the end of the day, I would close my book and I would see the book, my appointment book, and I would see the book closing it. And I knew that everybody would be there tomorrow when I came back. The appointments were there. I was going to follow up. I would get up out of my desk and I would push the chair in. I no longer sit at this desk. Now, it took me a long time to get out of my office, but I would do these things and mentally push my chair in. I would go to the door and I would turn off the light mindfully. I'm closing the light on this time in which I'm with others, and I would close the door. And on my way home, it was about a 30-minute drive. And on my way home, when things would pop into my head about the people that I was working with, I would say, it's okay. They're contained in my office at home, at work. And then the same thing would happen. I mean, this is not a magic elixir, but at home, I would, if my mind would pick it up again, I would close the door on it again, gently and compassionately to them and to me. And those behaviors combined with the cognitive restructuring helped me, allowed me to be who I needed to be at home. So it's hard. Yeah. It's very hard, and it takes a lot of work.
That's really good, Darlene, because you were describing how my life was when I was working in inner cities. It's very much like that. Thank you very much. That was really good.
Jen, are you stepping in?
I'm trying.
You're there.
I was just gonna try to move our compassion conversation a little bit, because I love the expertise on the panel. And for those of you that don't know, I'm a lecturer at the University of Houston, and so I have 900 students this semester, and they're all very overwhelmed with coming back to campus. But the struggle then is for all of us that have this compassion for our work and for our students and for the people we are in service to, coming back to take care of ourselves, not just I love the close the book analogy. When I first started teaching high school, I couldn't leave my office until the desk was completely clear so that I could walk away from it. And I had to learn that was never going to happen. But anyway, but where are we on our compassion for ourselves? Yeah. That is a huge struggle for me. I grew up in a situation where I needed to be perfect to earn the love that I was receiving. And so the compassion for myself and having nonviolent communication with myself, it has been a path that has been a really long time. So hearing it in his words and stopping to say things like, what are the needs that are unmet today, or what values have been crossed, that instead of getting upset with myself, I can do that for other people, but I'm not so good at it with myself. And so I just wanted to hear what other people were doing and thinking and struggling in that chapter.
So I just finished another Brene Brown training literally Friday called Dare to Lead. And it's really about like how you do this corporately. And some of the things that came out from the training that I thought like were light bulby things. And I'm glad Julia mentioned Kristen Neff, because Brene Brown kind of helped make her famous. Kristen Neff is a Buddhist teacher at UT. And Kristen Neff talks about a way of practicing self-compassion is basically to talk to yourself like you would talk to a friend. Right. So if a friend comes to you and says like, you know, I just lost my dad and I'm just not productive, you would say like, well, of course you're not productive. Right. But if you just lost your dad and weren't productive, you might find yourself saying like, you are such a loser. Like, why? You've got to be able to function. And so she's like, well, just consider when you hear that inner voice, is this what I would say to a friend? And then the really question is, are you willing to become friends with yourself? And what I really appreciated from this training is Brene Brown's favorite image for how you build trust is what's called a marble jar. And by the way, marble jar parties are a really bad idea, according to Alfie Kohn. But she sort of says, you know, when you're in like kindergarten, you get a party when the teacher sees everybody doing the right thing. The teacher puts marbles in, and when you fill it up, you get a party. And she sort of says that's how trust is built in like really small things, not huge things, actually. Like people notice you got a haircut. They just notice, right? Like people pay attention to you, or they remember your parents' names, or they remember it's your birthday, or your priest shows up in the hospital unexpectedly. Like just little moments like that, little tiny things. And sure enough, when people don't notice, or when they make a blub, marbles come out of the jar, right? Sometimes, honestly, people can do things and break the whole jar. Like, well, I'll just give you an example. Like somebody could have you could find your spouse had an affair, and a lot of people find that to be like jar breaking, and then you have to figure out how can I rebuild a container or not, right? So like there's very extreme things that can happen, but one of the things that came out in the training is we have to build that jar with ourselves. And the way we build that jar with ourselves is in really small moments of noticing, observing instead of evaluating, right? Of talking to ourselves like we would a friend, instead of like what I often do, like, I can't believe you did that again. That's one of those moments like, hey, look, you're pulling marbles out of your jar with yourself. So let's just pause while those are still in your hand, and let's think if we can't come up with a way to put them back. And it's really hard, Jen. It's really hard because I think most of us on the screen were taught it's okay to help other people, but you should never need help. In fact, it's good to help other people. Helping is good, just you should never need that.
It's also a self-defense. If I'm helping other people, then I'm not vulnerable and needing other people because I'm giving out and not bringing back. And when you said, you know, be your best, like be a good friend to yourself. My kid played tennis, very competitive tennis, and was terrible to himself on the court sometimes. And I would tell him, if you were playing doubles, you would not have talked to your doubles partner that way. Yeah. So, you know, it's interesting that you can give out the advice, but then you can't take it and give it back to yourself. So anyway, but it's been good timing because I feel like I'm a very slow learner. And I have to make that mistake like 20 times. And instead of saying, okay, well, you've made it 20 times and, you know, forgiving myself, I am hard on myself. Like, you've already been through this 20 times. Why are you still making this same mistake? So it was nice. And I liked his example of he didn't want to take his kids in carpool. But it was his choice to take his children to that school.
Yeah.
You know, so anyway, thank you.
No, thank you. And I think this is what Jesus has in mind when he says, doctor, heal yourself. And I think we can get hung up on like, oh, I'm a hypocrite and go to a place of shame instead of, wow, I'm also injured. And the way I heal other people, boy, I could use some of that healing from myself. If it's okay to say, I want to name like three quick things I'm thinking of, and then I'll be quiet, I promise, because I'm over talking like I always do. One core for me religiously is I'm so stuck that Jesus did everything perfect and I'm supposed to be like that. So I'm really trying to stumble into maybe the difference. I mean, honestly, you can render that word perfection, you can render it as holiness, which is about being extraordinary. Because look, as I read the story, the guy wasn't always nice. He just wasn't. And you heard me preach a couple of weeks ago about him and this Syro-Phoenician woman. And I'll tell you, I think he made a mistake. And the difference is like, he was like, oh, okay, I made a mistake. And if it's worth doing, it's worth doing poorly. So like, I can learn from this, like it's okay. And if I'd had a theology about learning from mistakes instead of never making them, I think it would have been helpful. And I have to drill that way down in my core, right? Because down in my core, I'm supposed to be perfect because God's perfect, instead of, well, how extraordinary would it be if I could just be comfortable in my own skin? How extraordinary that would be, even warts and all. Because look, I got to be honest, my skin as I age is getting more barnacles on the body of life. You know, like these little bumps that just show up and like, God, go away. Like, why are you there? You know, the other bit that for me, Jen, I realized is that giving can be really controlling, because as long as we're the giver, we're in control. And I have to admit, receiving sometimes makes me feel really out of control. And the way I can control receiving is I write a thank you note, or I practice reciprocity. And maybe one of the best ways we can ever receive is not write a note on purpose and actually enjoy the gift. And say, I am not writing a note. I am not giving anything back to this person. And all I'm going to do is just hold on to the vulnerability that somebody gave me something. And like, what if that was prayer for a month? That was all you did in your prayer life, was receive little gifts with the discipline to not say thank you. You'll go back to saying thank you later. I know it'll drive you crazy, but sometimes we do all this response stuff to help us control somebody giving us stuff. Like, I'm the master of the thank you note. I usually write it before you leave my house. And it's a good thing. And it's a way of like trying to get some control back over a gift, if I'm honest. And so this is one of those tough bits, because like theologically, I learned God gave us Jesus, and in order to be grateful, you better do this, instead of like, look, God gave you this gift. And see, I learned as a kid, salvation's a gift, but you have to receive it. That is not the definition of a gift. A gift is yours no matter what you do with it. And I really wish we drilled down on that in church. So what we really think of most gifts as being investments. And to be honest, I usually make investments instead of gifts as well. Like, I give stuff and I don't expect thank you. I expect it to make a difference in somebody's life. And when I take my kids to piano lesson, stuff like that, I got a lot of expectation around that, instead of I've chosen to give you this thing. Now, I understand investments have a place in our world, right? I don't give my 401k. I do invest that, and like for a reason. But if everything's an investment, then it's really just about control and not compassion, honestly. So like, another spiritual discipline is like, once a month, give something. Give. And just let it be a gift.
Oh, yeah.
And I got to say one last thing for me, and this is my biggest struggle. And I want to out myself. I have the hardest time having compassion, and this says a lot about me because I have trouble giving myself compassion, with clergy. And the reason being, we all got the same degree. And so I think they ought to know better. I mean it. I mean, I struggle with it. And so if somebody with an MDiv, and I don't care where they went, if they preach a sermon and they say the world is 6,000 years old, or they talk about like penal substitutionary atonement only, I am as hard as hell on that person. I mean, really. Or if somebody who's clergy, like they say they don't return a phone call to a parishioner who's had somebody die, or they don't show up, or they say they're too busy, I am hard as hell on that person. Absolutely hard. Or if somebody with an MDiv writes me an accusing email when they should have known better than to do that, I am so hard on those people. And part of it, like I say, is because we do this, I do this comparison thing where like, look, we have the same accredited curriculum. So why are you preaching that nonsense that we learned in Bible 101 not to be promulgated? And like, why are you withholding communion from somebody? Like, why are you doing that? And it's really, really hard for me. And if I really drill down, I mean, that's the work I need to do. Like, why are you so worried about what other people are doing with their degree? And part of it is, right, like, I want my degree to be this external indicator of like what I know and what I ought to do. I'm looking to something else for some validation. And it's really, I don't know what your biggest compassion blockers are. Often it's my kids. When I was a teacher, man, I could have compassion left and right for my kids. And I tell you, as a priest, I have a lot of compassion for my people. But for the clergy, nope. For my own kids, I'm like, you should know better because I taught you better than that. It's really hard.
Yeah. So similarly, and I'm going to put an excuse in here, I have similar feelings about how people teach sometimes about Jesus, because for me, it's a beautiful story. And then to reduce it to what they reduce it to just makes me mad, because you took a beautiful love poem and you reduced it to reading it like it was a bus stop list, right? You know, you took this great writing full of poetry and you reduced it to the laundry list. I mean, you're not giving this whole beauty to people, and it really upsets me. And I feel like those are the people that I have a hard time being compassionate for. That's kind of my whole as well.
Yeah. So always that question, Mike, and for me too, right, is like, that means I'm having some trouble being compassionate with parts of myself. And like, what are those parts and why am I so afraid of them?
Yeah. I will say something about the times that I've had deep conversation with people, where I'm going to say that empathy or compassion or whatever we want to call it, but that deep listening to others, I have always walked away from those feeling like I learned something about myself.
Yeah.
And I'll give you a very specific one. I was doing marriage counseling as I was a pastor for a couple of years, and I was doing marriage counseling for friends of mine. And, you know, I walked away from one of the sessions thinking, wow, those two shouldn't be together. And by the way, in my own marriage, these exact same things have shown up. And that's not what ended my marriage, but that's what set me down the road, right? These realizations that I got from having these conversations, where I was just listening to them and trying to sit with things like that. But you can't interact with another human being without being affected. I mean, there's that's just the way it works. When they say that everybody that you talk to, Christ is in those folks, I believe that because I've been ministered to that way. I've learned stuff about myself that way, and you know, I hear what folks are saying about, you know, you can become fatigued and you can take on those and have almost PTSD from that. I heard that, and that sort of rings true, but I also can learn a lot just by talking to folks. So about yourself. So it's always been a net good for me when I have these interactions with folks.
Peggy, please. Peggy, we're not hearing you. Your microphone's on, but for some reason we can't hear.
There you go.
Is it
Yeah,
on
now you got it. You got it. Yeah.
In the chapter on anger, I had a hard time differentiating that with fear. My sister has a tremendous fear against Sharia law. And as a result, she hates Muslims. She fears them, and so she hates them. She has a lot of anger. Certainly 9/11 and everything since, and now with the Afghanistan folks coming over and all that we've gone through there, it just has fomented her fear. She was in a beauty parlor having her hair cut and done, and the lady that was washing her hair had a hijab on, and she was Muslim. And my sister said to her, "I'm an infidel, I'm a Christian, do you want to kill me?" And the lady said, "Yes." And so, of course, she told the proprietor of the beauty shop that this lady was going to kill her, and she didn't think that it was a good thing to keep the lady, and the lady was subsequently fired for that. So this fear of Muslims, something that's different from her Christian upbringing, has brought fear, and as a result, a lot of anger. So she can't understand anything with immigration unless they're like her. So I've had a hard time differentiating that between anger and fear. I think maybe they both go together.
Yeah, now Darlene's a psychologist, so she's kind of probably going to beat me on this, but I you know, there's this thing called affect theory developed by Sylvan Tompkins. And affect theory basically says there's these hardwired responses that happen to us before feelings come on the table, and they happen in our limbic system. And there's like 8 of them, including sadness and joy and shame, which have some like they're instinctual, and they have these responses, and those end up turning into like feeling centers. And curiously enough, according to affect theory, anger is not a feeling, it's an auxiliary. It is one of those 8 things, but really what it is like this exponent or this multiplier that goes on the outside. And a lot of times, I'm not saying anger is not real, but a lot of times we use the word angry when quite honestly, what we mean is disappointed or frustrated, or in general, it means afraid. But you know, like anger is a way of taking fear and throwing adrenaline and cortisol behind it, instead of going into the flee or the freeze response, right? So the way Brene Brown would say this is like in these moments, like where we're really like our buttons are pushed, we usually either move against somebody, which is like attack, we run away, right? Or we try to like take what they say and become pleasers. And that's how we stand still. And these are ways of being, none of which frankly are very helpful, but they're in some ways like the emotional equivalents of fight, flight, and freeze. Mm-hmm. And a lot of that, right, that's so hard, you know, and I don't, Peggy, I don't know how to do this, except like the first time I met some Muslim people was when I lived in another country. And I met these people, and it's going to sound really crazy because I was a fundamentalist Christian, absolutely. I knew all Muslims were going to hell. I knew they were all evil, awful people. And then I met 3. This is going to sound nuts because I'm not like one of those weird people who normally says what I'm getting ready to say, but they exuded hospitality. And like within 5 minutes of meeting them, I didn't even talk to them about anything. I knew they were better people than I was. Here I go using comparison again, but like they had this hospitable, peaceful, like aura. And I was like, oh my God, like if these people believe all the wrong things, which I think they do, and they're like more peaceful, hospitable people than I am, I don't know what to do. Like, it was really, really hard. And I could either say like, well, I got them wrong. They probably are like making bombs in their room. And I thankfully chose not to do that. I just had to really contend with the category that I'd met these real human beings. And that challenged the whole label. And this is one of those things where like traveling globally is really, really important, and meeting other people is really important, because like until you know a counter narrative, you don't know a counter narrative.
That's right. That's right.
And I often get really angry at people who are angry. Instead of what he does in the book, I just genuinely wish you had some of the positive experiences with Jewish people and money that I've had. And I can wish that without hatred or judgment, actually.
I feel like just listening to sort of everyone talking, and then that chapter on anger about like checking in with your own needs, or like what is the unmet need that is underlying that for yourself, right? And then I guess also other, your sister or whoever, like what is the unmet need underneath that? I think again, it just like goes back to like being, it's just hard to always, it takes a lot of work to try to figure it out,
Yeah.
And then the one other thing, this is going back, Jen, you had said something like, what are you doing for self-compassion? And that same lecture that I'm referencing, keep referencing, the one thing that they said, and I'm like, oh, I totally held on to this because this is so easy, but it was let your breath be a reminder to include yourself in compassion. So every in-breath is for you. And so that's something that's really easy. Like when you see yourself getting kind of, take a deep breath in, and that breath is for you, and keep breathing in until you can, give again, or, I don't know. I thought that was a helpful little tool. Graciela, I think you're muted.
Muting yourself.
There you go.
Okay, there I am. I was a student of yoga for a long time, and I haven't been back to it for a while. But one of the main things that I thought I learned that I felt very appreciative about is when they talked about breathing. They talked about breathing God in, so that every breath, and maybe some of you have experienced it in yoga, every breath in is God coming into your soul or your body, and every breath out is sending him back out again. And maybe that sounds hokey, but there was a sense of peacefulness and something much bigger than myself, and it just, so that breathing, just simple breathing, could become something really kind of special and focused to calm a person down. So I don't know, that's just something I learned in yoga years ago. So maybe some of you have experienced that.
It shows up in Genesis chapter 2, for what it's worth. I was just talking to the school kids about this because I'm loosely telling them stories for the Bible as it goes, right?
Okay.
And like the human being's made out of clay and God breathes into it, and moving air in the Bible is called spirit, which means, right, that God breathed life into all of us. So even that clay you don't like is animated by God's spirit. And then are our animal friends, because they essentially are made the same way, right? And like that breathing is really important. And then in Hebrew, God's name sounds like
yes. Okay. Yeah.
And we, like you'll hear in the sermon today a little bit that in Greek, like your center of your being is your heart, and that's fine. But in Hebrew, the center of your being is your throat. because
Yes.
that's where the breath comes
Yeah.
in and out. So it's interesting to think about that. And like one of the things maybe that I think faithfulness requires from us, or invites, I shouldn't say require, and maybe in my own head, I was listening this morning, I thought, we talk so much about having faith. Maybe we should just talk about practicing faithfulness, because that would be like easier point of entry. is to think like, hey, in the middle of like being disappointed with myself, like God's name and spirit and presence is like happy to animate me. Like coming face to face that like God enjoys us more than we enjoy ourselves. Like that's an interesting theological turn to practice. I used to think that when I did something wrong, God was like, oh, there you go again. And I had this nun really help me do a little bit of like at least theological conceptual empathy. Like when I make a bad choice, actually God understands why I did that.
Yes.
Like understands, like, I know why you did that, because I know this with my kids sometimes, like when they make a choice, I rarely am like, you did evil. I'm usually like, oh, yep, no, I know why you did that. And I get that. And like, maybe we can work on that. And so like what if God's like that with us, and I don't mean what if, like probably like, hey, in our worst decisions, like God gets why we can't forgive certain people, or God gets why we like resort to bridge burning instead of compassion. Like God understands. That would be really different for me.
He never gives up on us, I think. He's always there with a breath or whatever it is, he doesn't give up on us.
There was this thing that a few of us on the screen did called Dismantling Racism. And one of the lessons that happened to me, my favorite, it talks about God being the master artisan. So it looked at a bunch of art, and the only comments you were allowed to make were appreciative ones. So a lot of them were like, honestly, very contemporary or abstract. And there was even like a drag queen, like smiling. And there were some like cultural dances, and then there were the hoodoos out in Bryce Canyon, and I like the thing I got from it, especially like because we did the Enneagram after it, was this idea that like, hey, God's not just like one kind of artist. Like God doesn't just do realistic portraiture. God does like Baroque style and contemporary and abstract. And so we all are different kinds of art and expressions of God's creativity. And so making room that like, hey, like maybe I'm just a modern abstract piece of art, which is not normally the kind I gravitate toward, but the kind that God was happy to create and express God's self with. I don't know, like those seems like another one of those theological gateways, right, into being like, okay, like this is just God's expression. It may not be the kind I most want to, but it's like God's expression. So like, how can I get my head around what God's trying to express through me? Somebody on the call I was on for 4 days, we were in these small groups, we were giving gratitude at the end. And people were like, thanks for being vulnerable, thanks for sharing, thanks for your trust. And somebody yesterday wrote like, well, I'm kind of grateful that Mike's kind of salty. I was like, I'm not salty. Like, what do you mean salty? So I asked my wife about this, and she was like, yeah, you are. And I was like, well, what do you mean? She was like, well, like you have this way of like doing things that is like sometimes like kind of, well, it's salty. And coming to terms with that, which was initially off-putting, has actually been pretty enjoyable. So I think those are parts of the things like when you get these descriptions, is there a way that instead of being like, oh, I am not, instead of being defensive, like, oh, maybe, okay.
Yeah.
I think just one more thought. So, and like talking about, being self-compassionate with yourself, right? And sometimes it's just really hard to do that. And so then saying like, well, okay, if I can't be compassionate with myself, God can be compassionate with me, and I can, like, that's like a nice twist that, when you can't do it for yourself.
I had this prayer I shared in the rite of reconciliation that basically says the other person who's hurt us is also hurt. And God, if I can't forgive them, forgive that part of me that can't forgive them. I mean, it's this sort of it's a Jesuit prayer. And lately Jesuits seem to be like really great folk with those kinds of thoughts. So I think it's great, Julia, exactly what you said. Darlene, please.
There's a way of redefining self-compassion and self-care, which helps those of us who are twos.
Yeah.
And those of us who see taking care of other people as a primary function of who we are. I like to think in terms of, I can't help others unless I take care of myself. Right. When I am so depleted, I have no compassion. I have no ability. I have no energy to help others. So I'll redefine it in that I am taking care of others. I am taking care of my ability to take care of others through taking care of myself. It's a twist, but sometimes it helps those of us who are so focused on others. I have to do this for them.
Yeah, thank you. And maybe one last word about Kristen Neff. I don't want to make an unabashed plug, but one of the things she says that's really interesting is that we've made this confusion between raising our children to have self-esteem and self-compassion, and those are very, very different things. Self-esteem leads to entitlement, and self-compassion leads to, well, compassion. Hey, here at the conclusion, I'm not going to be here next Sunday, and I don't want to be on the screen. I actually want to be off. So we'll take a break next week. And actually, I don't want to give us any more reading. I want to come back and do some practices on what we've done so far, because I want to try to create a way where we can this sink in. So let's come back on the 17th, having not read any more, but having thought about what we've read, and let's see if we can't do some practicing together. Does that seem okay?
In Nashville.
I'll put this in the e-news too. No meeting next week, and you'll get to enjoy the Reverend Canon Joanne Sailors in my absence, and I hope you will enjoy her. I will see you all soon.